Good evening. I hope everybody is doing well. This is the Week 7 discussion board. And I picked 3 articles this week that all deal in some aspect with the city of Louisville. And in each one of these articles, there's a primary focus on African Americans and how they were treated in terms of the period right after the Civil War, not only in Louisville, but the greater Bluegrass geographical region area, which would include northern Kentucky and Lexington as well. But also how African Americans had their rights infringed upon in the elections of 1905 in Louisville. And also looking at how many of these African Americans are going to move to Louisville in the decades of the 1930s, 40s, and even in the early 50s. So the first article was by Luther Adams, headed for Louisville, Rethinking Rural and Urban Migration in the South. In this particular article, it primarily focuses on the 1930s and 40s and the large abundance of people that are going to move from rural parts of Kentucky to Louisville seeking employment opportunities during the Depression and also during World War II. I found it very interesting as a little side note that this article starts off by talking about my hometown of Russellville and the fact that one of these individuals and their families is going to move to Louisville, moves from Russellville, and the very first sentence of this article starts off that there was a Confederate flag flying in the small town of Russellville, which I could go into more detail, but for time's sake, I won't. But needless to say, excuse me, that the majority of the focus by Adams in terms of sources is primary, secondary sources, books and articles and things like that. There were a few interviews, but primarily the focus is Louisville was already the largest city in the state. It had more industrial capacity and industrial opportunities than any other place. So African Americans and others, mostly poor whites and other minorities, moved to Louisville during this time looking for economic opportunities during the Depression and World War II. In the second article, Tracy Campbell looks at the politics in Louisville in the 1905 election. Now, we in Kentucky, we are notorious for having fraudulent elections. It's almost kind of a running joke. And in this particular election, we're in the middle of the political boss period of Kentucky history. And the mayor of Louisville, who was a Democrat, the Democrats have primarily always controlled the city of Louisville, used the police force and other means to try to keep African Americans from voting. They were, in some cases, beating African Americans. They were imprisoning them for trying to vote. And then on top of that, you have other general types of election fraud in terms of people trying to vote twice, bribery, paying people for their votes, and things like that. I found interesting that for sources, Campbell primarily used court cases, newspaper records, the census of 1900 and 1890, along with some secondary sources, including some articles. But the key focus is that elections in Kentucky historically have been fraudulent, and this is long before the modern period. An individual by the name of Doc Beecham, who was a political boss in the state of Kentucky, was notorious for handing out $2 bills in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to people who would vote the way he wanted to. So, we've kind of unfortunately always swept those types of things under the rug, very sadly. The last article by Michael Ryan looks at the conduct and how African Americans were treated during the decades of discord, in the period right after the Civil War. And this source is primarily focuses on primary sources, a lot of letters, a lot of court cases and legal documents like affidavits and others, very few secondary sources. So this, I thought, was some excellent research into the subject. The Freedmen's Bureau was by far the largest collector of information in terms of how African Americans were treated in the Bluegrass region. And this information is compiled and put together in terms of families being beaten, being in some cases lynched, and these former slaves, these African Americans that now have their freedom and are supposed to be treated as equal citizens, in many cases across the Bluegrass, were bound. Children, just unspeakable things happened to them. And again, the primary sources here outline the validity and also the just utter harshness of people of the past. And, you know, it's so unfortunate how these individuals were treated in the just few years after they'd gained their freedom. In some ways, as I heard one historian say years ago, it's kind of like they went from slavery they went to a new form of slavery in terms of sharecropper systems, and then the arrival of the KKK and things like that. But these are the 3 articles for this week. I hope everybody has a great day, and everybody take care.